You guys know what to do. You know the drill. Hit the like button. It helps fight the algorithm. It helps with the channel. In any case, I have a special guest for you once again. It's the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott is, of course, as you know, former Marine Corps, U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. He was also a United Nations weapons inspector. Honestly, his expertise in such matters is really unparalleled, in my opinion. Scott, how are you doing? It's great to have you back on the program.
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's been a month since you were last on, and that was quite the hit. Honestly, that video went quite viral. I've seen it translated into I don't know how many languages, including Russian. I think it's millions of views in total. I had people in Kazakhstan like hitting me up and say like, "Hey, I saw your video. My mother saw that video," and I was like, "What? Really?" Yeah. So it went really viral. People really enjoyed it, and I wanted to bring you back on because when you and I were live, it was literally as the invasion, special operation, whatever people want to call it, was happening. And now it's been about a month since the Russians went into Ukraine. Given your expertise, I just wanted to get your take on what the situation looks like now. What are some of the predictions that you had that didn't pan out? What are some of the predictions you had that did pan out? We keep hearing from the Western press that Russia's losing. Is Russia losing, or is that wishful thinking? What do you think is happening?
Well, I mean, to be honest, we don't know. We're in the midst of an information war being waged by the United States, Ukraine, and others that has dominated the mainstream media. So we're held hostage to sort of a single river of data. The Russians don't seem to be interested in waging a counter narrative or providing a counter narrative. They seem more focused, rightfully so, if you're a Russian, on fighting the war on the ground in Ukraine rather than fighting the war in the in the war of public opinion. So right off the bat, outside observers like myself are we're prisoner to the data that we have, which requires therefore a lot of analysis, a lot of speculation. Hopefully informed speculation, but speculation nonetheless. I think when we first talked, I'll be frank, I was expecting a much more violent, rapid offensive by the Russians, because doctrinally that's what they do. Doctrinally, the Russians bring overwhelming firepower, followed by a massed assault to literally grind their opposition into nothing and then break through and exploit the interior, et cetera, et cetera. And I was then, and I am now, of the opinion that the Ukrainian military simply can't stand up to that sort of assault. I don't know if we talked about this. Did we talk about what the Russians have come to call the Syrian approach when we talked?
No, we didn't talk about it.
All right, so. I was left scratching my head watching the Russians going soft. Now I know that Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership said we're not at war with the Ukrainian people, that we're not at war with even the Ukrainian army, that they sought to minimize the interaction. But nonetheless, from a military perspective, I've always been taught that you fight as you train. And the Russians have been training to fight using standard Russian military doctrine. And suddenly they come into Ukraine and they're doing something completely different. And I listened to an interview that a Russian general gave to a Russian media outlet. And he talked about what he said was the Syrian approach. Now, this might come off as odd for some people, because if you listen to the mainstream media, the Syrian approach is supposedly the hammered fist. You blow Aleppo into nothing. You use chemical weapons, et cetera, et cetera. But the Syrian approach, from the Russian perspective, was to negotiate a solution. If you recall, the way that the Syrian military won back its territory was to apply military pressure. But when for instance, the jihadists were surrounded, the Russians would come in and negotiate a withdrawal, and they'd bring in the buses, and the jihadists and their families would get on the buses, and off they go to Idlib, and everybody lived happily ever after. So the Syrian approach that the Russian general spoke of was that Russia would seek to negotiate their way through Ukrainian towns, villages, even cities, talking to the mayors and telling them to stand down, that Russia has no intention of occupying your territory, that Russia simply wants to implement its special military operation and denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Now, denazification, of course, it's violent. So the Russians weren't going to give the Syrian approach to the Azov battalion or others. They were going to die violently or surrender and be brought to justice. Demilitarization from the Russian perspective was asking the Ukrainian military to stay in their barracks and allow Russia to dismantle what Russia viewed as a NATO proxy, which is what the Ukrainian military had become, a de facto NATO proxy. And then, as we have learned, again, this is reading between the lines, but that the Russian leadership is unhappy with some senior FSB generals who were responsible for preparing the battlefield, so to speak. These are the guys who, before the military came in, were tasked with going in and liaison with these civilian mayors and such, and getting assurances, even liaisoning with Ukrainian military and getting assurances that they would indeed stand down and let the Russians come through. And the Russian military came in very soft. They sent in lightly armed forces who did, probing, moving through areas, et cetera, and then they got ambushed. They got hammered. They got slaughtered. And even then, the Russians didn't come in hard. The Russians regrouped, and then the Russians carried out a very methodical advance on a very, measured pace. It's a pace, by the way, that's still more rapid than had occurred during the Second World War. If you study the major battles of the Second World War between Germany and the Soviet Union, the early days, 1941, the Blitzkrieg, and then later the battles of annihilation that were waged in maneuver between 1943 and 1944, the Russian army today, in many cases, was advancing at a pace greater than either of those. I mean, because the reality of modern war is it's dangerous, it's bloody, it's difficult, and we should never minimize the capability of the Ukrainian military. They're going to lose this war. There's just there's no debate about it. They cannot win. But that doesn't mean that they roll over and play dead. They're putting up one hell of a fight. One that I think many people, including myself, were surprised, and we shouldn't have been, because this is a military that had been trained since 2015 to fight to NATO standards.
Right.
And they had received very good equipment. They have highly motivated soldiers. They have great leadership. They have good communications. And they're defending on their home territory. True. So, all things said, there's a lot of advantages that go. They also are operating at an extreme numerical advantage. Normally, when you attack, you want to attack with a 3-to-1 advantage. So for every one defender, I need 3 attackers.
It's the other way around.
Russians are coming in backwards. They're coming in for every 3 defenders, there's 1 Russian.
Right.
And so how do you deal with this if you're Russia? How do you and it became obvious early on how they were going to deal with it. First of all, you don't get bogged down in city fighting. Why? Because cities suck in forces. Take a look at the lesson of Stalingrad from the German perspective. So 1942, the Germans fight some early battles around Kiev and Izium, by the way.
Right.
And they fought off a Soviet counterattack, and then they launched this battle of maneuver where they're pushing the Soviets back. and they come to Stalingrad, and the smart move would have been to bypass Stalingrad, leave it alone, surround it, and keep going. But instead, they decided they were going to capture and seize it. They tried a coup d'etat. It didn't work. Then they had to grind their way through, and it literally sucked all the forces in. And if you study the German disposition by the end of 1942, you're seeing that the vast majority, the Sixth Army, is all in Stalingrad. You can't do that with 200,000 troops that the Russians had, because literally one fight for one city would take 200,000 troops, take all your troops. So, but you also have to shape the battle. How do you shape the battle so that you are the one bringing the initiative against 600,000 defenders? And you do this through maneuver warfare. And this is where the Russians have the advantage. I mean, let's talk. I mean, what am I talking about when I say maneuver warfare? If you go back and study Napoleonic warfare, I mean, if people want to read a book, I would recommend reading Jomini's The Art of War. It's about Napoleonic warfare. And you're saying, well, why is Napoleonic warfare relevant today? Because concepts come out. For instance, the concept of maneuver, not armored maneuver, but maneuver. You have a feint. So you're going to do a feint here to get the enemy to react. You're going to do a diversionary attack here to get the enemy to commit. You're going to do a fixing attack in the center to hold the enemy in place. You are going to outflank the enemy. I mean, these are Napoleonic concepts that exist to this day. You want to read another book, read Little Hart's The Strategy of the Indirect Attack. It's basically taking Jomini's Art of War up through World War II. And now we talk about tanks and airplanes. And we talk about, rather than doing the frontal assault, you do the indirect attack. You come where the enemy's not expecting you, forcing them to react to you, maximizing your military force. And the modern day application of this from the American perspective was the Gulf War, a Desert Storm, right. The war that I was involved in. And you take a look at the concepts. We did an amphibious feint. We put 5th Marine Amphibious Brigade off the coast of Kuwait, and we fixed a dozen Iraqi divisions in place. They couldn't move because they were afraid that we're going to come in on the shore. We used 2 Marine divisions to launch a fixing attack along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border to hold the majority of the Iraqi army in place. We did a feint up the Wadi al-Batin by 1st Cavalry Division to hold the Republican Guard in place, freeze them, while the main effort did the big hook, outflanked them, rolled them up, and won the war. And we all sat there and went, wow, Americans are really clever. And we are. We know how to fight war. That's what we did. We study it. Well, you know who's also very clever? The Russians. You know, they actually invented many of these modern concepts when they fought the Germans. They understand this very well. They study it. They teach it. They practice it over and over again. So we shouldn't be shocked to find out that their war plan in Ukraine is actually sort of the modern epitome of maneuver warfare concepts. For instance, how do you get the Ukrainian government to keep 100,000 troops fixed in Kiev and divert their reinforcements, their reserves that are in Western Ukraine to Kiev? How do you do that? You send 40,000 guys running down from Belarusia, you put some airborne troops in the airports near Kiev, and you force Ukrainians to react and respond. And believe me, these fights aren't easy. The Russians lost a lot of guys, but they achieved their strategic objective of holding the Ukrainians in place, forcing the Ukrainians to focus on this as a major battle. For them, it was. They don't want their capital to fall. But realistically speaking, are 40,000 troops really going to capture a city of 3.1 million? No. But they threatened it. The Ukrainians responded. What else do they do? You need to have the ability to maneuver. And so when you have forces in Crimea and then forces coming out of the Russian area near the Donbass, you have Mariupol and an entire Azov Sea coast controlled by the Ukrainians. So your forces are split. You never want your forces split. So you need to create a land bridge that connects them. And that was one of the first things the Russians did, is run up the coast, come down the Donbass. There's Mariupol, the one city where the Russians have fought. And how many troops did they commit to this? Mariupol took about 50,000 Russian troops.
Right.
because they were fighting anywhere between 15 and 20,000 Ukrainians. So it's a major battle in Mariupol that destroyed the city, by the way. It's very tragic, it's awful fighting. But that's the city they fought for. They're not fighting for any other city. Kharkiv, again, they threatened it not to take it. They're hitting the flanks, forcing, there it is, forcing the Ukrainians to divert forces to there. But the majority of the Ukrainian army is in the Donbass, between what you see, Luhansk and Donetsk to the west there. The majority of the Ukrainian army, about 120,000 of their best troops, are right there. And the Donetsk and Luhansk militias have fixed them in place and ground them back in a very bloody fight, but it held them in place. Now, in the meantime, the Russians are carrying out in-depth attacks. They're destroying the fuel, the ammunition, the communications, and they're grinding down.
Do you feel it's targeted? Because as you said, they've been kind of reserved in their attacks. You expected them to grind down the Ukrainians when they came in, like they usually do. But do you feel that they've been kind of more, picking their targets more carefully, just focusing on military things?
Very precise targeting, because one of their underlying objectives is to minimize civilian casualties, what I'll get to in a second, and to minimize damage to civilian infrastructure. And so they've been very targeted on this. They blow up the fuel depots, they blow up the ammunition, they blow up some barracks, they blow up. You know what they're not blowing up? Trains. I mean, look at CNN. We got, every day we get the wonderful story of people leaving Kiev on a train to Lvov. I will tell you that if I was a strategic air planner, the trains would have been blown up on day one, because I don't want mobility. I would have blown up every bridge in Ukraine so they can't move, the Ukrainians can't move their forces. I would have blown up their highways so they can't move their forces. They'd have to divert off the highways. None of this is happening. None of this is happening. The Russians are ceding some operational advantages to the Ukrainians because they don't want to destroy the infrastructure. Yes, they have blown up defense industries, but that came after the Ukrainians decided to fight, not before. It's a secondary objective. But what's happened now is that the Ukrainians have lost the ability to fight a coordinated, cohesive battle. Their major brigade, they had 24 brigade-sized mobile formations. Those have all lost the ability to function as a brigade. They've been broken down into components, forces, and right now they're defending in place, but they can't maneuver. They don't have any gas. You know what you call a tank that doesn't have any fuel? It's a coffin. What do you call an artillery piece with no ammunition? A grave. And you know what you call a soldier who's hungry, tired, and thirsty? Either dead or a prisoner. And this is what's going to happen, because that's what the objective of the Russians has been all along. Now that they've shaped the battle, controlled the battle, they don't need to threaten Kiev anymore. They have the Ukrainians up there trapped. The Russians are now pulling out their best offensive units and bringing them back down, and they're going to start punching down near Kharkiv, punching down south. They've taken those 40,000 troops that are no longer investing Mariupol, and they're bringing them up, and they're going to punch out towards Dnipro, which is right where the D in Donetsk is. And those two arrows are going to meet in the middle, and when they do, 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers are going to be trapped in a giant cauldron.
Right, so that's what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
It looks like a pincer movement or a cauldron, doesn't it? Right.
Exactly.
I mean, it's been looking like that for a few weeks now. I was wondering why it hasn't been closed in through the middle. What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, again, because in order to do that without the preparation of the battlefield, you would have to use the old Russian doctrine.
Right. Okay.
Right now, and what the Russians have, again, 100% speculation. I'm going to say right off the bat, I don't have the Russian playbook because it's never been published, and I don't have a phone that takes me straight to Vladimir Putin so I can ask him what's going on in his brain. So I am speculating. I think I want to make that very clear. This is informed speculation based upon prior military experience and an understanding of Russian tactics and adapting it to a unique situation, because the Russians are doing something totally different and, frankly speaking, totally unexpected. But once you accept what the Russians are doing and redefine, recalibrate your military mind, you see that instead of pounding away with artillery to get the quick breakthrough, the Russians are taking a slower, measured approach. They're destroying, as I said, fuel dumps, limiting mobility. They're destroying command posts, limiting communications. They're destroying ammunition dumps, limiting the ability to sustain the fight with artillery. And then they are grinding away, pounding away on a daily basis the ability of the Ukrainians to fight large-scale cohesive battles. This is in place of the massive artillery bombardment. The massive artillery bombardment would give you a breakthrough in days. The Russians have taken a slower, measured approach, which will achieve the same breakthrough, but it's going to take 30 days.
Well, what do you think of?
Now we're going to look at, I think, a faster pace of combat going forward, because the Russians have retained their mobility, their cohesiveness. The Ukrainians lack this now, and I think we're going to see a culminating point being reached where this pincer that we've been talking about is going to snap shut sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I mean, where does NATO come into all this? Because as we know, they've been giving all of these weapons to the Ukrainians, these NLAWs supplied by the British. You know, is there a possibility that, you know, they could tip the balance in favor of the Ukrainians because of the weaponry that they're sending? As you said, that this, you know, the Ukrainian army is no joke. They've been trained to fight the Russians. It's their home turf. Do you think that with enough weaponry they could tip the balance? Because you know, they were talking about letting the Polish lease their airfields and their planes, and then the Americans are trying to beg them to do that, and they walked it back. So it's not really clear what's going on. It's just they appear to be just throwing as many weapons as they can at the Ukrainians. Is that going to help them in the long run?
Well, let's back off first and talk about what NATO can do and what NATO has done. From 2015 until literally a few days before the war began, NATO had been actively training the Ukrainian military. There's an amazing slide from the United States Department of Defense. I was surprised with the honesty of it, but it talked about at the Vorov training facility, the one that was bombed by the Russians a while back, you know, killing a bunch of these foreign legionnaires and such. The slide says that NATO was training 5 Ukrainian battalions a year to NATO standards. That means that they are interoperable with NATO. That means I can go to a German division, pluck out a German battalion, put in a Ukrainian battalion, and it functions in a cohesive fashion with them. So it's interoperable. But then they did an amazing thing. 5 battalions a year, then they drew a line and they took it to the Donbass so that they could fight here to kill Russians. So NATO has been training, and again, from 2015 till 2020. Well, won't give them credit for 22 because the year didn't start, but let's say 21. So that's 6 years. That's Marine math. I think that works. And 5 battalions, 5 battalions a year. That's 30 battalions. That's a lot. And they trained 30 battalions for the sole purpose of fighting in the Donbass to kill Russians. Now they trained other battalions too, but the bottom line is, you know, these Ukrainian forces are very well trained, and they had been trained on the Javelin missile, right. Which is a very effective, anti-tank munition, and they got a lot of them. But these weapons don't win wars. These weapons are what I call small arrow war, meaning when you're focused on winning a tactical battle. So you're talking about moving a squad here, a platoon here, in a company-sized fight where you're speaking of employing, a javelin team here, a javelin team there with a stinger team in the back. That's small arrow stuff. And the Ukrainians are very good at it, very good at it. And when the Ukrainians are able to cohesively apply small arrow tactics against the Russians, they've been winning. They win those tactical battles. They've been doing that. Not everyone, but they win a lot of them. And we've seen the videotapes. They win It's an impressive victory. They slaughter the Russians. But what we don't see is when the Russians apply big arrow, a war against the small arrow people, because all those nice little infantrymen running around doing this stuff die instantly when the Russians come in with massive artillery. And even though the Russians aren't using massed artillery to punch their way through an enemy line, when they identify a concentration of Ukrainian soldiers, they will bombard them and kill them all. And the Russians are able to more effectively apply big arrow tactics operations than the Ukrainians are small arrow stuff. So all the Ukrainians have been getting from the West is small arrow support. They get a lot of missiles, but these missiles, all they really do is, yes, they end up killing a couple Russian tanks. But to be honest, these missiles are causing more Ukrainians to die because they lock the Ukrainians into a mode of war that simply cannot prevail on the battlefield in the long term. The number of Ukrainian dead is going to shock the world when that number comes out. The Russians said, before the city of Mariupol fell, that they had killed, I think it was 14,000.
Right. I was going to ask you about that because Moscow said 14,000 Ukrainians killed, as you correctly pointed out, and NATO says that they've killed between 7,000 to 15,000 Russians, that the Ukrainians have killed 7,000 to 15,000 Russians. Do you think those figures are accurate on both sides?
I think the Russian figures are very accurate, and I think the Ukrainian figures are propaganda, and I'll tell you why. To accept the NATO figures, you'd have to accept that the Russian military is not a professional military. You'd have to accept the fact that what the Russians view as sacred duty to the motherland, that is military service, a sacred duty that goes back to the Great Patriotic War, is meaningless. It was all myth. What it means is that the Russians can get the Russian soldier killed and then lie to the Russian family about the death of a son in combat. That's not what's happening. The Russian families are being notified. The bodies, when they can be recovered from the battlefield, are being sent home. The Russians are a professional military force. And to suggest anything other than that the Russian numbers are accurate is to literally, you're creating a narrative that says these are not professional people, these are amateurs, these are, this is a joke. No, I know the Russians. I know the Russian military. They're extraordinarily professional. That doesn't mean that they're perfect. I'm not saying they're 10 feet tall, but what I am saying is that the notion that they could be suffering 15,000 dead, but only reporting 1,400 is ludicrous. It's absurd.
I mean, the figure itself is, that's more than the U.S. lost in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2003 and 2019.
This is a completely different kind of war, though. This is the kind of war where you can lose 200 men in a couple hours of fighting because it's so brutal, so deadly. So,
right.
You can lose a lot of people, but understand the Russians came in with 200,000 people. And if you're telling me that they've lost 20,000 dead, that means they've lost probably 3-to-1 wounded ratio, 60,000 wounded. That's 80,000. They've suffered close to 50% casualties. That doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. And the military remains cohesive. And we know the Russians are cohesive. We know they're functioning. So right off the bat, NATO's numbers don't add up. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are, they have 260,000 regular troops, but they also have 300,000 reserves. And they've mobilized, maybe 100,000, 200,000, territorial militia, these civilians that got the guns, et cetera. Territorial militia and the reserves do not last long on the field of battle. They don't know how to fight. They don't know how to maneuver. And they oftentimes get caught in the open by artillery and slaughtered. The regular forces, they do better, but nonetheless, they pay a price. But the Russian casualty figures did not include Mariupol. There were 15,000 Azov battalion and Marines in Mariupol. They're all dead.
So that's what I wanted to ask you, Mariupol.
Literally, it's as simple as that. They are all dead. So we have doubled the number of Ukrainian dead. It's no longer 14,000. It's closer to 30,000.
You think that that's accurate?
That's a low number.
And those are the best fighters that they have, right? Supposedly.
Well, as of, I don't know if they're the best fighters, they're fanatics. The Marines were some of their best fighters. The Marines were very well trained, and they made Azov a living hell for the Russians. But the Russians have Mariupol today. Ukraine doesn't. Russia may have lost, another 500 to 1,000 men. The Ukrainians lost 15,000. That's just the reality of the war that we're fighting. Now we're getting ready to fight an even greater battle of annihilation, where the Russian casualties are going to go down and Ukrainian casualties up, because the Ukrainians no longer have the ability to fight the kind of battle they fought prior. They can't maneuver now. They're stuck. If they get into their vehicles and move, Russian air power comes in and kills them. Drones kill them. Artillery spots them and kills them. So they're dug in place. And the Russians aren't going to grind it out. The Russians are simply going to surround them, cut them off from all logistical support, all hope of reinforcement, and then pound them to death until they surrender. That's the war. This isn't going to cost the Russians a lot of men. It's going to cost the Ukrainians everything.
Right. I just say that the Azov are supposedly their best because the BBC was trying to rationalize why it's okay to have, Nazis on your side because they can fight well, apparently. I wanted to show, again, I wanted to show one of your tweets. You tweeted earlier that CNN continues to amaze me with the misleading nature of the news they choose to broadcast. They claim Putin has signed an order for the emergency conscription of 134,000 troops to replace casualties from Russia's quote-unquote failed military campaign in Ukraine. And then underneath you go on to point out that this is apparently standard procedure. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on it for us, Scott?
Sure. I mean, look, the Russian military today is about 70% professional. The Russians call them contract soldiers. These are people who either voluntarily or they got drafted and decided they wanted to stay in and they signed a contract for a longer term of enlistment. But 70% are, we call them volunteers in the United States, the all volunteer army. Well, the Russians, it's a contract army. Same thing, professional soldiers. But about 30% of their military continues to be conscripted forces. And the Russians use these forces for non-complex missions. These aren't your special forces. These aren't your armored forces. These are your truck drivers, maybe your mechanics. But even on the mechanic side, it takes a long time to train a mechanic. They're only conscripted for a year. There's 2 rounds of conscription. There's a fall conscription and a spring conscription. They call it a campaign. For instance, a spring one, the campaign begins on April 1st and runs through July. What happens during the campaign is, around 600,000 men who are required to be prepared to provide service show up at these military reporting stations where they're screened for their, whether or not they're capable of being soldiers. They're given a physical screening, educational screening, etc. And then if they pass muster physically, educationally, etc., then they're considered for service. Some of them get waivers. Some of them want to go to college. Some have technical skills. Some are employed in defense industries, so they're given a waiver. But at the end of the day, the Russians have, over the past several years, selected around 134,000 per campaign. And so, but that number is set by presidential decree. And so for the spring campaign, the presidential decree is signed at the end of March. That's what's happened. Putin simply signed the spring campaign presidential order telling the military screening process that you are to select 134,000 conscripts for the spring campaign. And the selection process will take place between April and July, and the people you select will go to training.
Mm-hmm.
They're training. They get 2 months of basic training. Then some of them get up to 4 months of additional training. Then they're sent to a unit. And by law, they're not supposed to be sent into a combat zone unless they have like 8 months of training. And another law is they're not allowed to be sent to a combat zone outside the territory of Russia unless they're contract soldiers. Now, there's a lot of rumor and speculation that some of the soldiers that have been killed or captured are conscripts. If so, somebody made a mistake. And again, I'm not one to sit here and tell you that the Russians are incapable of making mistakes. You have a lot of truck drivers, and that's what most of these conscripts end up doing is driving trucks. And so it's plausible that some general, some colonel decided that it was too hard for him to replace the conscripts with regular drivers and kept them in place, and they rolled in. It's not supposed to happen.
Okay.
And it's an embarrassment to Russia if it did happen. But it doesn't mean that Russia's weak, Russia's suffering, Russia's ready to fail. It's just it's what happens in a large military when people take shortcuts. And the Russians are as susceptible to that as we are in the United States. So that's what's going on with conscription, but it's not some sort of emergency measure to gin up 134,000 troops to send to Ukraine. That's not what's happening. What appears to be happening is that Russia is pulling some units. For instance, there's talk that some units have been withdrawn from Georgia, from Nagorno-Karabakh, and elsewhere to create fresh, the battalion-sized combat teams, and to put these into the battle. And this is only normal. Again, people say, aha, isn't that proof that Russia suffered huge casualties? No, it's proof that Russia's carried out 30 days of sustained combat operations under very difficult circumstances. There's always an operational pause. You can't expect people to be superhuman. To wage a mobile conflict for 30 days, A, you're going to suffer casualties. B, your equipment's going to break or just get worn down. C, you're going to be exhausted. So at some point in time, there must be an operational pause where these troops get a chance to pull back, rearm, re-equip, get some replacements, and reorient and be prepared to send back in. While that's happening, you will replace them with fresh units. And so what the Russians are doing is assembling troops that are capable of replacing the units that need to have a pause. But the fact that you're having a pause does not mean that you're losing the war. Far from it. You won't find an example in modern. Heck, when we drove to Baghdad in 2003, we had to have a pause because we outran our logistics. Our tanks literally had no gas. If the Iraqis had a viable mobile armored force, they could have caused us a lot of problems because when we took that pause just short of Karbala, our tanks had no gas. They were stuck in place until we get the fuel up to them. And this is a war where the Iraqis are not putting up the kind of defense that the Ukrainians are. So, it's only logical that the Russians would seek an operational pause, and that's what happens between phases of operations. The Russians have announced the end of phase one, transitioning to phase two. And so we're seeing a lot of things that should normally be occurring in a circumstance such as this. And again, pure speculation on my part. I call it informed speculation, but this isn't me having access to the Russia book. I could be 180 degrees wrong on this. It's possible because I don't have access to the intelligence. I don't have access to everything that would give me absolute fact-based knowledge. What I do have is experience, and from this experience, I'm applying that to the available fact set and providing speculative analysis. I think I have confidence in my analysis, or I wouldn't be having this conversation with you.
I wouldn't have
If I-
we wouldn't have bring you on, Scott. The videos wouldn't go viral otherwise. So, you know, something else I wanted to ask you, given your military background, is the Geneva Convention. You know, I'm sure you've seen these videos where I'm not sure if I can say it because of the YouTube algorithm, but you know, there's a video that was confirmed by the New York Times to show Ukrainian soldiers committing war crimes. Yeah, in the kneecaps. Do you feel that also the videos where they're showing prisoners of war, because I've seen the Russians showing Ukrainian prisoners of war and Ukrainians showing Russian prisoners of war. Do you feel that there have been Geneva Convention violations on both sides?
Well, you just articulated a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. You're not allowed to use prisoners. You're not allowed to film them or put them in a situation where their images, makes them uncomfortable, et cetera, et cetera. It's a violation. We had a situation where President Biden just a couple days at the tail end of his 4-day trip to Europe, meeting with the Polish president, called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Shortly after, Anthony Blinken issued a statement that said that the United States is accusing Russia of committing war crimes. And it's curious. I mean, Blinken didn't give us a total rundown, but he gave us an idea of the things the United States was worried about. You know, attacking hospitals, attacking a maternity ward, attacking civilians, attacking residential areas, and things of that. And on the surface, you'd say, "Wow, I've seen some videos of apartments blown up. I've seen the video of a hospital hit. I've seen all this. Is this true? Are the Russians carrying out these kind of attacks?" There's a couple things that people have to consider. One, it's almost impossible to charge somebody with a war crime during war. Michael Hare wrote a great book about the Vietnam War called Dispatches, and it's a line that he wrote in that book that was not stolen, but used by Francis Ford Coppola in his movie Apocalypse Now, Martin Sheen's character. But it was like charging a man with murder here is like issuing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500. It's like ridiculous. You're supposed to drive fast. War, you're supposed to kill. There's rules though. There's the international humanitarian law and the laws of war that are derived from that are supposed to govern combat, conflict, so that you don't end up creating a humanitarian crisis for civilian populations. In order to do this, a couple things have to occur. One, the attacker has to ensure that any target he strikes has a military purpose, a legitimate military purpose, and that the amount of force used is proportional to the military gain expected. So to give you an example, if I have an apartment complex with a sniper up on the 3rd floor, I can bring a tank in, aim the tank gun at the 3rd floor, and fire around through there, even if there's a family in that room, because there's a military necessity, and the proportionality gives me a military advantage that makes the civilian casualties legitimate collateral damage. What I can't do is bring in 3 thermobaric bombs and drop the entire apartment complex. That's disproportional to the situation. So now we have to ask ourselves, are what the Russians doing disproportional when they attack this? Because what we're finding out is that the reason why the Russians are hitting these apartment buildings or these stores or these hospitals or these schools is that the Ukrainians have made a decision to deploy their forces there, to deploy ammunition there, to deploy their armor there. And in doing so, they have literally wiped out any protection that is afforded to those locations and the civilians located there. They've turned all of these into legitimate targets of war. So the question isn't, are the Russians aren't allowed to bomb them? They are. The second Ukraine puts a military object next to a protected area, it's no longer protected. It only now comes down to a matter of proportionality and intent. We know that the Russian intent is to come in soft. They've received orders. They've been told, protect civilian life, protect civilian property. Now, people can say, okay, they said that, but are they actually doing it? And I will answer this by talking, again, military math. Normally in the history of war, one civilian dead is usually matched by one combatant death. So if you have a campaign fought in an area where there are civilians, if you lose 50,000 combatants on both sides, you can expect that there'll be 50,000 dead civilians. That's just the horrible reality of war. It doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it bad. I'm just telling you what the math is. So now we come to Ukraine and look at some of the numbers. Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's say they've lost 30,000 dead. Let's say the Russian numbers are now up to 3,000. That's 33,000 dead. The UN right now is talking around 5,000 to 7,000 civilian dead. So what does that tell you? When you have a situation where the number of dead, instead of being 1 to 1, is 1 to 4. For every dead civilian, there's 4 dead combatants. And when you take into account that the reason why there are dead civilians is the decision made by the Ukrainian military to turn civilian areas into a battlefield by putting their soldiers, their ammunition, and their equipment there, it's telling you that the Russians are being very assiduous in their use of force, that this is a very measured approach, that the Russians are complying with the dictates of international humanitarian law. You know who isn't? Ukrainians. And I'm not talking about that video. Look, there's going to be isolated violence. When you have men killing men in a visceral, animalistic fashion, which is what combat is, not every man handles it the way they should. And when you get your bloodlust up, when you get your anger up, when your discipline breaks, when your leadership fails, bad things are going to happen. There's no doubt in my mind that we will be able to document bad things happening on both sides. But when we speak of systemic violations of international humanitarian law, there's only one side violating it systemically, because what do you call it when you have a civilian population in place? You haven't evacuated them as you are required to do if you want to make this a battlefield. And instead, you keep the civilians in place and you put your military equipment there. It's called a human shield. That is a violation of the international humanitarian law. That is a war crime. It is Ukraine that is committing the most massive violations of international humanitarian law, and we all know it. We all know it. We see it on TV every day, but we excuse it because we call it the noble Ukrainian defense against the brutal Russian attackers. But it's not, there's nothing noble about putting civilians at risk. That is a crime under international humanitarian law. And that's just the reality that will eventually be accepted once the dust has settled, the emotions have calmed down, and people examine the facts in their totality, free of prejudice.
But Scott, are you talking about the instances where you had Azov or other groups like them blocking civilians from leaving Mariupol, for example, or do you mean just the fact that there are so many people that are being told to just stand their ground and basically fight the Russians? What do you mean exactly? Because some people might say, well, the Russians are just using that as an excuse. They're going to bomb civilians and then claim that they were human shields. That's what they say about the Russian military tactic in Syria and in Ukraine.
Right. Well, I'm not going to speak to Syria because I don't have the data set in front of me. What I do know about what's going on in Ukraine is, for instance, if you recall, the Russians hit a shopping center in Kiev a while back. And the first thing is, this is proof that the Russians are hitting civilian targets, until we found out from the video the Ukrainians were parking multiple rocket launch systems and ammunition for their 2S7 Prius artillery pieces all throughout that area, that the Ukrainians had turned this into a legitimate military target, which the Russians had no choice but to take out, which they did. That's what I'm talking about. And these kind of actions are, in far greater proportion than, for instance, the gross human shields that took place in Mariupol. That's a gross violation of international humanitarian law. And it's also different from Ukrainians deciding that they collectively want to fight, including the residents, fight for a neighborhood, which you're seeing in, for instance, the northern suburb of Irpin, where there's been heavy fighting. And a lot of civilians died because they decided to stand and fight. Those aren't human shields. But human shields are the people who live in an apartment complex who think that they're protected because they're in an apartment complex, only to find out that right behind them, the Ukrainians parked all their armor or all their ammunition, or they were using the bottom floor as a command post. And when the Russians identify this stuff, believe me, I believe the Russians possess a packet of targets that they're not bombing because of the issue of proportionality. Well, for instance, if I have a command post in the bottom of in the basement of an apartment complex, and I hit that command post, I could collapse the building, killing hundreds. So the Russians, just like we would, have lawyers come in and say, that's a disproportionate use of military force. We can't do that. We have to find a different way of addressing the problem set that this command post presents. So you jam the communications, or having recognized it there, you intercept the communications, find out who they're communicating with, and you take them off the field of battle. You use a different approach, but you don't blast that away. But when the Russians make the decision to attack, it's because somebody has looked at it and said, the Ukrainians are getting a disproportionate military advantage for what they're doing here. And that if we allow this to continue, we will not be able to prevail on the battlefield. So we must take this out, and we will use the force necessary. And tragically, that means that civilians who live in that area will pay a price and will die.
And you're speaking of because this goes along the line of self-defense. I wanted to ask you about Article 51 of the UN Charter, because again, for the viewers, those who don't know, in the UN Charter, Article 51 pertains to the right to self-defense, so either individual or collective. And I saw your great piece in Consortium News. I saw some of your tweets as well. And this is a genuine question that I have, because, I see the United States and Israel invoke Article 51 when they bomb Syria or they bomb Iraq. No one seems to mind that. Here, Russia also invoked Article 51. If I'm not mistaken, you believe that they are correct to do so, and they have the actual legal justification to do it. Why do you think so? How can we rationalize and reconcile this with Article 51? Because the rest of the world, or let's say the Western world, says Russia's violating international law. Is it really? If it's invoking Article 51?
Well, let's just start with the basics. The greatest war crime of all is the illegal war of aggression. That's not me saying that. That's the Nuremberg military tribunal after the Second World War condemning Germans to die for the crime of promoting illegal war of aggression. And from this came the United Nations Charter, which sought to ban conflict. That's one of the, you're not allowed to go to war. Yep. But they recognize, humans being humans, that we're going to go to war. But there's only two conditions that are set by the United Nations Charter that are exceptions to the ban on conflict. One is a Chapter 7 resolution passed by the Security Council that authorizes military force to be used to resolve a threat to international peace and security. The war I fought in, the 1991 conflict with Iraq, was authorized by a Chapter 7 resolution saying that the world was authorized to respond militarily to remove Iraq from Kuwait, which had invaded and occupied in August of 1990. Now, people can be against the war. They can say whatever they want, and I respect that. You can't call it an illegal war. It was not an illegal war. We can say it was an unjust war, da-da-da. Please, go ahead. But it's not illegal. Now we come to Article 51. Article 51 is self-defense. And this is the one that basically says that if you're attacked, you have a right to defend yourself. It also talks about collective self-defense. So if you're attacked, people are allowed to come to your assistance to assist you. But it's predicated on the notion that you have been attacked. And someone will say, well, wait a minute, Ritter, Russia wasn't attacked by Ukraine. How come Russia gets to invoke Article 51? Now we come into the concept of preemptive self-defense. And this is actually an old concept under customary law and such. In fact, one of the key cases for this is an incident in American history, 1837, called the Caroline Affair, where an American ship was preemptively attacked by a British war vessel because the British said the Americans were getting ready to provide assistance to Canadian rebels. And therefore, the British had no choice but to attack the Americans first. And so the exchange of notes between the United States and Great Britain under the Caroline Affair became sort of the legitimacy of the concept of preemption. But a key aspect of preemption is the notion of imminence, that there has to be an imminent threat that leaves you no choice but to act now, as opposed to there's a threat here, but I could actually go to the United Nations and try and get a Chapter 7 resolution to get people to come to my assistance. So I don't need to attack today. So the issue of imminence comes in. There's also the issue of jurisdiction. How did Russia justify Article 51? Well, the first thing they did is they talked about the notion of collective defense. And what they mean by that is that they are aligned with the newly independent republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. Because without that, people will say, well, wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, even under Russia's geopolitical analysis, are part of Ukraine. So how can Russia come to the defense of Ukraine to protect it from Ukraine? Article 51 would fail there. But now that these are independent nations, Russia can articulate that claim. But people will then say, but wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, they're not United Nations members. So how can they suddenly talk about United Nations rights, but they're not United Nations members? Now we come to collective defense. And fortunately for Russia, NATO has provided a wonderful case study, because in 1999, NATO attacked Serbia, citing Article 51. Now, NATO is not a member of the United Nations. How can they do that? Under the notion of collective defense, that NATO assumed the character of a mutual defense alliance arrangement. And therefore, that collective can speak of preemptively attacking to defend the collective against an imminent threat. The imminent threat, of course, being Serbia. Now, NATO hyped up the threat, called it genocide when it wasn't genocide, but that's a different issue. The bottom line, though, is that NATO justified their actions against Serbia under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, using collective defense in a non-UN member state association. So Russia comes in and says, we are now affiliated with Lugansk and Donetsk in a collective defense matter, and we are coming to their defense over the Ukrainian attacks that have been taking place for the past 8 years in the Donbass. But now you'll even say, well, okay, even if we buy into this, Ritter, and you have to because that's sort of the law, that doesn't justify them going against Ukraine. And it justifies them defending Lugansk and Donetsk, a limited military operation. Now we come to the other thing. Russia says, yes, but Ukraine has been massing their forces opposite Donetsk and opposite the Donbass, 100 to 120,000 of their best troops. And they were preparing an attack on the Donbass to recapture it. And therefore, we had to preempt that attack with a larger military incursion, the special military operation. And when we decide to expand that, we had no choice then but to take into the totality of Ukraine, because if we simply fight a battle against the 120,000 troops, that frees up Ukraine to bring the rest of their military down on us, and that would create a disadvantage for us. So we had to expand the scope and scale of our operation to include the feint in Kiev, to include the fixing operation at Kharkiv, to include the assault out of Kherson, the land bridge, and the air campaign to neutralize everything. All now are linked to collective self-defense because Ukraine was getting ready to launch an attack against Donbass, and Russia had to preempt that. The other thing that Russia used as an issue of preemption was Zelensky's misguided statements to the Munich Security Council,
right,
where he said, we need to get out of the non-proliferation treaty and we need to acquire nuclear weapons.
Basically.
And Russia went, we have intelligence that you may in fact be trying to do that. So they added a WMD clause to their justification, and they moved in. I don't know what the viability of their intelligence is, but what I can say is, in Chernobyl and in the other nuclear power plant that they took control of down south, there are giant pools of water that contain spent uranium fuel rods. These are highly radioactive waste that could be ground up, mixed with high explosives to create a dirty bomb.
Right.
And the Russians claim to have intelligence that the Ukrainians were at least considering doing this. They also had intelligence that said that in these depleted uranium fuel rods, or the spent fuel rods, 10% of their weight is actually plutonium-239, which is used for nuclear weapons. And that if the Ukrainians wanted to extract the plutonium-239, they could then have the fissile core necessary to produce a nuclear weapon. So therefore, we need to gain control over these ponds to make sure that this isn't happening. And there was an imminent need, citing Zelensky's own statement at the Munich Security Conference. So that's another element of imminence that's added to this. And I think combined, we see that Russia has articulated a cognizable case for genuine Article 51 authorization, as opposed, for instance, to the United States, who invaded Iraq in 2003, citing the imminent threat of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and the nexus between an Iraqi government possessing weapons of mass destruction and al-Qaeda terrorism. Both of those turned out to be false. So the United States lied to set up a artificial predicate for preemption under Article 51. So the United States case is 100% invalid. It turns out that the Russians actually have a pretty sound case derived by fact, far more valid than any case that either NATO or the United States made involving issues of preemption.
Yeah, it's interesting because all these steps that you mentioned, it is kind of taking a page out of the NATO playbook, except that it's actually cognizable, as you said. There's actually something to it, whichever one you want to look at. You mentioned the Zelensky's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he sort of alluded to or implied that Ukraine was, the Russians at least see it that way, that Ukraine is interested in nuclear weapons. I mean, speaking of WMDs, what do you think about these biolabs, the US-funded biolabs? What do you think the real purpose is? What do you think of the information that's come out? What's your take on all that?
Well, I mean, the real purpose, I'll take the U.S. at face value. The real purpose was to bring control to Soviet-era biological weapons laboratories that were repositories for deadly weaponized pathogens, and to provide gainful employment for former Soviet biological weapons scientists who, if these labs were simply shut down, would have to seek gainful employment elsewhere. And there was a danger of their skill set migrating to areas in the world that we didn't want them to migrate. So when the 2005 agreement was signed between Ukraine and the Department of Defense through the Defense Threat Reduction Act, or a reduction agency, that was their goal. And it's not just about taking over the old Soviet facilities and trying to repurpose them. It's also about building new facilities that could be used as an incubator for gainful employment that we talked about. Now, what can defense research facilities do? These biolabs. Well, they can do the environmental sampling that is taking place all the time. I mean, to stay ahead of potential pandemics, we have scientists around the world that are collecting data, collecting samples from animals, from the earth, et cetera, to try and see if there's anything out there that could become the next pandemic, and to nip it in the bud, to do the research. And some of that research is fairly controversial, as we've seen just talking about COVID, and some of the research that was done that people said, oh, well, man, this gain of function shouldn't be happening. I don't know if they're doing gain of function in Ukraine. I'm just saying that there are aspects of this kind of biological research that are inherently controversial.
There's anthrax also, for example, which is,
anthrax, I mean, I got anthrax right now in New York. I've got anthrax literally within 2 miles of my house. I can go find a dead deer and probably scrape some anthrax off of it. So, it exists in the wild, and you want to check it. Again, piece of history. Iraq acquired its anthrax strain. I think it was called the Ames strain, as in Ames, Iowa. They got it by simply applying for it to the United States. As part of this standard biological research, they said, we'd like some of this Ames strain so that we can develop vaccine, or not vaccines, but we can develop responses to it through the research. Well, what they wanted is, because that's a very virulent strain, they wanted to turn it into a weapon. That's a different story altogether. But my point is, there is this kind of collaboration taking place globally between scientists in an effort to effectively respond to the threat that exists in nature from biological pathogens. So that's legitimate. I don't know why you need 26 of them in Ukraine, though. That's another question. There weren't that many scientists to begin with. And I don't know why you need so many in Georgia, and I don't know why you need so many in Kazakhstan.
With
I think what
diplomatic
here,
immunity as well.
Well, there's that, but I think, to be honest, knowing the American system, what I think was happening here is money. Nunn-Lugar Act. You had Congress pass the Nunn-Lugar Act, which allocated hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to cooperative threat reduction in the former Soviet Union. And so you have a bunch of civilian contractors who are bidding on contracts and coming up with ways to spend this money. And some ideas are accepted, some ideas aren't accepted. One idea that appeared to be accepted relatively easily was this biological, these biological labs and joint cooperation. It almost became like a rubber stamp. So if you pitched the idea, the system received the idea, approved the idea, and implemented the idea, and that's money for everybody. So you're literally printing money by putting these biological labs in. And that's my assessment as to why there's so many of them, because there's really no logical explanation for this. Now, the problem comes with these biolabs is that some of the work they were doing was very suspect. I will tell you from my own personal experience that the United States has always operated in a gray zone when it comes to complying with its obligations under, for instance, the Chemical Weapons Convention or the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention. And what do I mean by that? When I was a firefighter in New York, I was a hazmat technician, hazmat specialist. And I went to all the federal training. For instance, I'd go to Anniston, Alabama, where we trained with live sarin and live VX agents. Now, that's good training because you train as you're going to fight. So if we're preparing for the potential of a terrorist attack using chemical agent, the people who are supposed to respond should feel comfortable operating in the actual hazardous environment that you're going to be in. Great, but who produced that sarin and who produced that VX? Somebody did. It was the United States. At Anniston, they have a laboratory scale production facility that produces live chemical agent. Well, isn't that banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention? Well, not if you use it for defensive purposes, but I can guarantee you that if we found out that Russia was operating a chemical facility in Mexico where they were producing bench scale amounts of sarin and VX nerve agent, we'd be very uncomfortable about that. We'd call it a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and we'd probably be right. But we get away with it because we, of course, are the exceptional superpower. We're inherently good. Nobody can ever think that we're trying to do something bad. And look at biological. You remember that anthrax attack at the end after 9/11, the one where the anthrax, dry powdered anthrax, was in envelopes through the mail system? It wasn't produced by a terrorist. It wasn't produced by a crazy scientist on his own. It came from a tube of dry powdered anthrax produced in Dugway, Utah, at a biological training facility. They use that anthrax to train people like me to operate in a live biological agent environment, to test the filters, to test the equipment, etc. Well, okay, but it got out. It got loose, and it became a weapon that impacted millions of people. That's sort of what the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention is supposed to prevent. So even in our own home, in our own country, we're running footloose and fancy free when it comes to the treaty. Now, there's things that can be done overseas that can't be done here in the United States. And I believe what happened here is that the Department of Defense got a little greedy and started to implement programs using the Ukrainian facilities that were borderline or even downright violated the treaties. Would never be allowed here because of the oversight that is done. People would say, hey, you're violating. Give you an example. The CIA, I believe in 2001, got a hold of a Soviet era bomblet that's used to disperse in aerosolized fashion biological pathogens. And the CIA went, ooh, neat. We'd like to reverse engineer this to see how effective this was, because we need to know in case we ever run into it from a terrorism standpoint. So we reverse engineered it and we tested it in terms of its ability to aerosolize. This is a blatant violation of the Biological Weapons Toxin Convention. And eventually somebody in the Clinton administration went, oh, wham, we're violating the treaty. We got to shut this thing down. And we did. Self-policing, because it's happening on our soil. Mm-hmm. But now in Ukraine, we have a situation where what are they doing? Studying genetic modifications of H1N1 avian flu, seeing how the genetic modifications are targeted specifically to Russian Slavs, not Ukrainian Slavs. They're excluded. And then we're going to vector it to see how it can be used on migratory birds to be spread into Russia. How is this defensive in nature? Now, I don't know if this is true. The Russians say they have the documents. If I saw the documents and I saw the numbers on it and all that, I would be able to trace it back if they're genuine, because every contract is a matter of public record because they're using taxpayer funds. So we'd be able to trace it back and say, this is true. I believe the Russians wouldn't have gone forward with this knowing the same thing I know, that it could be exposed as a lie. So I believe everything the Russians are saying is true, which begs the question, what the hell is the United States up? And I don't have an answer. Well, because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't meet the criteria of pure biological research, which is, we're just looking for this. It's not about collecting samples. It's about genetically modifying something to make it deliverable. It's not defensive in nature, because you're not saying the Russians are going to deliver it to us. We're saying we're going to deliver it to Russia. So that is the definition of an offensive biological weapons program, which is a clear violation of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. So, I don't.
Well, Scott, I got to tell you, those documents, they were out before the Russians ever mentioned them. There's this Bulgarian journalist, Diliana Gaitanjeva. I had her on the channel. She published these a while back, and they're public. Some of them, these documents. It's just no one bothered to look. It is shocking. It doesn't make sense to me. The way you just outlined it. It does appear offensive in nature rather than defensive. But I think, given everything else that the Russians have raised, it doesn't have to be the Russians, but just looking at the situation when we talk about Article 51, you don't even really need these things. I know. For example, the existence of Nazis in Ukraine. This is obviously a travesty in and of itself. That's a whole other issue. But even without it, I think you can make a lot of arguments because of NATO expansion, because of Luhansk, Donetsk, People's Republic, and everything else we talked about in Article 51. That this stuff is like just in addition to that. That's kind of just adding, making
Except
matters
that,
worse.
Unless you articulated, unless you were knowledgeable of it, cognizant of it, and articulated in advance, you can't invade to go on a fishing expedition to find justification for your invasion. So as bad as this biological weapon stuff is, it doesn't actually improve Russia's case under Article 51 because it's something you found out after the fact. What it does do, though, is it improves Russia's the overall legitimacy of their claim that NATO expansion posed a threat to. It just reinforces that claim, but it doesn't stand on its own as a justification under Article 51 because they didn't know about it before then.
Right. Actually, it's funny because I just remembered even after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 started, I think they were still looking for WMDs like until June or July. They were saying, we'll find them any day now. But
they were looking for them for years afterwards. I mean, I don't think they actually shut it down until like 2007.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I wanted to ask you, Scott, right now with these peace talks, you said on Twitter, you wrote that it's just a question of time before Zelensky surrenders. Are you adamant that that's what's going to happen? You don't see any other off-ramp for him? What do you think? What kind of concessions do you think he's going to have to make to the Russians? Although I think I know the answer, but I want to ask you.
Let's start from this way. From the Russian perspective, you don't sacrifice this much blood and treasure for a half-assed result. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on your show. For an incomplete result. Politically, this would not be a good move for Putin, despite his high popularity ratings. I think they would plummet. And it would be an extraordinarily damaging blow to the credibility of the Russian military and for Russia as a whole. You're asked, because this is beyond simply what's happening in Ukraine. We're talking about full-scale economic warfare with the West, decoupling with the West, major global, earth-shattering developments in terms of the economic aspects of this, and to suddenly say, well, we're asking everybody to make all these sacrifices, all this harm, and we're just going to stop halfway? No. So, what I know of Russian history, what I know of studying, the Putin government that has been in place for 22 years and listening to his speeches and evaluating his actions, he doesn't bluff and he doesn't back down. He's very measured in what he does, but when he does something, he's a man of his word. So when he says denazification, demilitarization, he means it. When he says, neutrality, he means it. There won't be compromises there. Now, having said that, the art of diplomacy is getting the other person to do something they don't want to do, and have them smile about it. Now here we're trying to get a diplomatic outcome through the application of military power, and you have to be careful because now a couple questions come to mind. How do we get an end game? I mean, what does the end game look like? We can assume right off the bat that Russia will want Ukraine to formally declare that Crimea is Russia. We can assume that Russia is going to demand that Ukraine formally recognize the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk. We now can start to assume that there's going to be a third administrative zone built around Mariupol that the Russians are going to insist have either a special autonomous status or independent status. There's just no way Ukraine will ever be allowed to govern Mariupol again, ever. It's what the Ukrainians did to the city of Mariupol from the Russian perspective is unforgivable. And I really don't care that the Ukrainians think what the Russians did is unforgivable, because the blame clearly resides with 15,000 as of Nazis who used the civilian population as human shields. And frankly, the Ukrainian army that went along with them, the Marines that were there. So that's a reality. Now, what's going to happen to the rest of Ukraine, I think, is it's an issue that'll be left to the Ukrainian government. How far do they want to take this struggle? Because the more Russia suffers, the greater the cost will be. It also comes down to what constitutes denazification. Is it simply the destruction of military units? Or, as I believe the Russians have articulated, it involves the delegitimate, there we go, to make delegitimate. You got a Marine using multiple syllabic words. It's dangerous. Yes, that word. Of the entire ideology. This worship of Stepan Bandera, this notion that a man who was a Nazi collaborator, all of that can be forgiven because he was an anti-Stalin resistance fighter. This needs to be purged, and it requires new legislation in Ukraine that bans this, outlaws it, but it also requires denazification of the political parties themselves. That is, it's not just the Azov fighters who are criminals, as we learned when we denazified Germany. The political leaders are also criminals. And I believe the Russians are going to hunt down and hold to account the right sector leaders and then every other far right-wing nationalistic party that embraces the ideology of Stepan Bandera, and they will purge them. And in purging, let's not mince words. You're going to die, or you're going to prison, or you're going to leave Ukraine. But if you're part of this ideology, you will never be allowed to live and operate on the soil of Ukraine again. You're either going to die, or you're going to prison, or you're leaving. That's denazification. Can Russia accomplish that? Is a fair question. I do believe Russia is going to defeat the bulk of the Ukrainian army, but I also think that this is going to create even more refugee-based pressure on NATO and Europe, on especially the border countries. And at some point in time, Russia is going to have to balance its desire for complete denazification with the reality that if they create too much of a humanitarian crisis through refugees, that there will be an increasing imperative on the part of the EU and NATO to create a humanitarian protective zone in Western Ukraine. And what I'm getting at is there may be a compromise where Western Ukraine is carved off of Kiev, so that denazification is accomplished not by going into Western Ukraine, but by detaching Western Ukraine from Kiev, from what could be left of a Ukrainian state. This is speculation on my part, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of aspects that this diplomatic picture is going to be influenced by what happens on the battlefield, both in terms of the military aspects and the humanitarian aspects of that. And we don't know all of this right now. It's hard to predict that. What I do believe is that Russia can't accomplish in a long-term fashion the acceptance of Crimea as Russia, the acceptance of Luhansk and Donetsk is independent, maybe this new Mariupol entity, with anybody other than Zelensky. Zelensky has been elevated to this Winston Churchill-like figure, hero worship around the world. Therefore, and I actually believe that this has been part of Russia's plan all along. Now you'll say, well, what do you mean? Why do you say that? How could you say that? Well, the fact that Zelensky's still alive means the Russians don't want him dead. That speaks volumes. Two, the fact that Zelensky is able to pick up his cell phone and make phone calls and do selfies and video things and broadcast it freely means the Russians are letting this happen. Russia could shut down the internet that quick. Russia could destroy all communications that quick. What Russia has done is left open communications channels so that Zelensky can have these conferences. Because if you think about it from a military perspective, would I want as a military leader to allow Zelensky to speak before the United States Congress in a way that motivated Congress to pressure the president to provide $500 million of military assistance? No,
Of course not.
no. But the Russians are letting it happen. They're letting him speak to NATO. They're letting him speak to the British Parliament. They're letting him speak to everybody. Why? Because it's a trap. They have created a situation where the world has invested all legitimacy onto the person of Zelensky. Therefore, if and when the time comes for Zelensky to finally surrender, and he will surrender, whatever surrender terms he agrees to are going to have to be accepted by the West. So the West can no longer say that the Russian invasion or the Russian occupation of Crimea is illegitimate. Why? Because Zelensky, Winston Churchill, said, no, we're giving it to the Russians. They can no longer say that the independent status of Lugansk and Donetsk is illegal under international law. Why? Because Zelensky, Henry V personified, has given it to the Russians as part of a surrender agreement, and the Russians need him alive to do this. Now, Zelensky has to also be careful because he's surrounded by ultra right-wing nationalists who right now say, hey, he's a very effective leader because he gets all the support. But the moment it appears that Zelensky's getting ready to surrender, these guys are going to kill him. They've already threatened. They said if he ever accepted Minsk II, the agreement under the Normandy format that was supposed to resolve the Donbass issue peacefully, if he had accepted that, the head of the right sector and Azov said, I will hang you by the neck until dead. He didn't say it in secret. He said it on a video that was published that Zelensky's aware of. And instead of, hunting this guy down and killing him, Zelensky instead starts giving out Hero of Ukraine medals to this guy's people, promoting him and others into positions of authority, legitimizing Nazi ideology, mainstreaming it into Ukraine's military and civil society. The deputy head of the police in Kiev is a member of C-14, I think the group is called.
Yeah.
So no, Zelensky is a prisoner to these people. And the moment Zelensky loses his credibility with them or his utility to them, they'll kill him, which means now Zelensky could flee Kiev. There's already talk about setting up a provisional government in Poland. Now, if Zelensky flees there, he's now a hostage of NATO and he will never agree to these surrender terms. So the Russians are playing a very, very difficult diplomatic game, which is why we saw Russian diplomats saying things that people went, oh my God, what are they saying? We're close to an agreement. They're not close to an agreement. First of all, the Russians aren't agreeing to anything. The Russians are dictating. They're just making the Ukrainians think there's going to be an agreement. But it's a process. But what they have to do is keep Zelensky close, keep him engaged, keep him believing that he has leverage that keeps him viable in the eyes. And they're going to have to pick a culminating moment that brings their diplomatic efforts and their military efforts together at the same time. And there will be a very narrow window where they can get Zelensky to agree to surrender terms before he flees to Poland or before he's killed. This isn't going to end well for Zelensky. It's tragic. The guy's operating way above his pay grade, way above his capabilities. He's never been made president, and he should never have been put in this situation. I feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for his family. He's not an evil person. He's not a bad man. He's a comedian that was whose popularity was politicized by oligarchs for political gain. And he's going to pay the price. He's doing the best job he can. The fact is, he's doing a great job. I mean, if you think about it, he's doing a wonderful job. But as I said, a lot of what he's doing, everybody's saying, well, he's doing the NATO narrative. Well, he is, but the Russians, I believe, are shaping that in a manner that benefits them, as I've already explained, because they need Zelensky to make any surrender agreement legitimate. And so how do you keep Zelensky alive? How do you keep him in Kiev? And that's done through very careful diplomacy. And there's no guarantee of a successful outcome. It's a risky business.
Well, we'll see what happens. It's something we're all going to be following closely. We've got about 4,500 people watching. Guys, please make sure you've hit the like button. Scott, you've been very gracious with your time. We're really happy to have you. I'm going to put your Twitter up on the screen so people can follow you. Are there any closing remarks or some final things that you wanted to touch on, perhaps that we didn't talk about?
Well, I mean, all I'd like to say is that this is a moving target, and anybody who claims to have absolute knowledge and absolute certainty should probably not be paid attention to. I speak with I'm very assertive. That's the Marine in me, and I'm confident in my facts. But I think what I always tell people is whenever I speak, don't believe me. Listen to me. Don't believe me. Trust but verify. Meaning that don't become a prisoner of what I say or what you say or what anybody says. Use this dialogue that we've had here as a foundation upon which to go out and test the ideas that were talked about here. Test the theories, test the data, but prove to yourself, because ultimately what we're talking about here, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere in the world, it's a collective failure of citizenship on the part of the majority of the world's citizens. We have allowed ourselves to become hostage to, corporate media. We've allowed ourselves to dumb ourselves down by necessity. I mean, we work 40, 50, 60-hour weeks. We come home. Do we really have the time necessary to spend hours upon hours studying a foreign policy issue when what we're really worried about is how we're going to pay a mortgage, how we're going to get food on the table? But what we've done is we've basically subordinated ourselves to a ruling elite, a ruling class who are making decisions in our name. And it's incumbent upon us to ensure that we can hold them to account, but we can only do that if we're informed citizens. So I think what we're doing here tonight is very valuable if it serves as the starting point for a greater journey of discovery where intellectual curiosity is the king. What we're doing tonight is extraordinarily bad if people think that what they're hearing here is the end all and that's it. You hear it here, you don't have to think anything else, and it's all done. No, if that's the case, then we've done a disservice to your audience if they're thinking that. So I think that's what I'd like to leave is I enjoy having these kind of conversations because I think it's an invaluable contribution to a process of discussion, debate, and dialogue. But I'm always hesitant because I don't want people to think that if Richard Medhurst or Scott Ritter says something that's it, man. That's the Bible. I'm taking that, and I'm not going to go any further because then we're just the same as corporate media. We've suddenly just become the same thing, just through an indirect approach. And I don't think that's what you want to do, and I know it's not what I want to do. So I thank you for having me on here. I'm glad we had this conversation, but I just hope that people view this as a starting point for a journey of discovery that's going to last not only throughout this conflict, but beyond. Because believe me, what's been started in Ukraine is going to resonate globally for decades to come. We didn't even talk about the economic aspect. Maybe we can do that later. But what's going on in the global economy right now? What's going on geopolitically? The transition from a single polarity to a multipolarity reality.
It's incredible.
It happened because of Ukraine.
Right.
But when this war is over, when whatever happens, this is going to continue. And it's going to redefine how the world works.
Yeah. So. Yeah, absolutely. Ukraine is the catalyst for so many things. I mean, we're seeing, Russia being pushed into China's arms, essentially. Iran, Venezuela.
I always look at Lavrov saying, what's really going on in his brain right now? Because, because China holds a lot of the cards, and Russia, it's a risky move to decouple from the West and pivot east, because you don't have as much leverage with China as you have with the West. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we'll definitely have to do this again soon to talk about the economic aspects of it. But Scott, I think you've definitely accomplished what you set out to do, which is give people at the very least, a basis to work off of. I think it's highly informative. Again, your analysis, your insight is really rare, and it's unparalleled. So it's always a pleasure for me to have you on. Thank you so much. I'll put your Twitter back up on the screen so people can follow you on Twitter. It's Real Scott Ritter, at Real Scott Ritter. I'll put a link right now in the chat. Again, thank you very much, Scott. And we'll have to do this again very soon. The viewers are obviously very happy with it, and
okay.
Who knows? Maybe this goes viral again too. So yeah.
Okay. Well, good for you then. All right. Well, thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure, and have a good night.
Likewise. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.